Welcome to Slumber Darkly, where darkness drifts on calm waters and unsettling stories emerge from the shadows of reality. In tonight's episode, we embark on a tale that is not only haunting, but one that lingers long after the details are revealed. This story will leave a mark, one that is difficult to shake. A fair warning, this is not for the faint of heart. If you choose to stay with us until the end, be prepared for a journey into one of the darkest chapters of small-town America. Close your eyes, feel the rain outside, and let the distant sounds of the storm calm you as we tell you the story of the Rogers family, a peaceful Ohio family whose lives were torn apart by unspeakable tragedy. It all began in a small, unassuming town called Wilshire, Ohio. Situated on the far western side of the state, Wilshire was a quiet, tight-knit community in 1989, home to fewer than 600 people. The town embodied simplicity. It was a place where hardworking, middle-class families lived their lives, largely uninterrupted by the turmoil of the outside world. Neighbors knew each other by name, watched out for one another, and lived lives of modest routine. Though Wilshire was a town that rarely made headlines, it was known for something far more valuable to its residents. It was an ideal place to raise a family. The streets were safe. Children rode their bikes down quiet roads, played on the wide-open farmland, and attended small schools where everyone was familiar. There was a sense of security in the slow-moving pace of life here, and that security gave families the space to flourish. One such family was the Rogers family. Hal and Joan Rogers, or Jo as she was known to her friends and family, were both 36 years old at the time. They had met as teenagers in high school, and their bond had only grown stronger as the years passed. Jo was vivacious, outgoing, and full of life. She had a warmth that drew people to her, a natural ability to make everyone around her feel comfortable and welcome. Hal, on the other hand, was quieter and more reserved. A man of few words, but a solid presence. He found comfort in hard work, and though he wasn't one for grand displays of emotion, his love for his family was undeniable. Their relationship had blossomed in their senior year of high school, when Jo discovered she was pregnant with their first child, Michelle. Shortly after graduation, they married, ready to embrace the future together. They moved to a dairy farm just outside Wilshire, where they began their lives as a family. A few years later, their second daughter, Christy, was born, completing their picture-perfect family. From the outside, their life seemed ideal. They worked hard, supported each other, and raised two happy, well-adjusted daughters. But life on the farm wasn't easy. Dairy farming was demanding work. Hal spent long hours tending to the animals, ensuring the farm ran smoothly, while Jo took on the task of working nights at a nearby factory to help support their family. She worked tirelessly, driving forklifts and working the assembly line to make ends meet. It was exhausting, but they made it work. Despite the hardships, the Rogers were known for their positive outlook. Their daughters, Michelle and Christy, were well liked in school. Michelle, at 17, was on the verge of adulthood, a bright young woman with a promising future ahead of her. Christy, just 14, was full of energy, always cheerful and playful, especially when she was with her family. The girls found joy in the simple pleasures of farm life. They would often play outside, laughing as they ran through the fields, or spent time with the animals. Life wasn't always easy for the Rogers, but it was fulfilling. Hal and Joe made a point to nurture their relationship, often sneaking away for breakfast or dinner dates, despite their busy schedules. They knew the importance of staying connected, of keeping their bonds strong, even amid the chaos of work and raising children. Together, they built a life they could be proud of, a life they believed was stable, secure, and happy. But beneath the surface of that seemingly perfect life, a dark secret was festering, one that would shatter their world beyond repair. In the spring of 1989, a devastating truth emerged, one that no parent could ever be prepared to face. Hal's brother John had been living in a trailer on their property for several years. He was family, and like many families in small towns, the Rogers had taken him in when he needed a place to stay. But John harbored a secret, a monstrous secret that had been kept in the shadows for far too long. For 3 years, John had been assaulting Michelle, Hal and Joe's oldest daughter. The abuse had been carried out in silence, hidden behind threats and fear. John had told Michelle that if she ever spoke up, he would kill her. And so, for years, Michelle carried that terrible burden alone, terrified to say a word, trapped in the horror of her own home. It wasn't until incriminating photographs were found in John's trailer that the full extent of his horrific actions came to light. The discovery was beyond devastating. John was arrested and sentenced to prison, but by then, the damage had already been done. The Rogers family, once whole and happy, was left in pieces, broken by the unimaginable betrayal of someone they trusted. Michelle, understandably, was deeply affected by the trauma. She struggled to process what had happened to her and couldn't bring herself to talk about it. The weight of her silence was suffocating, and her parents, especially Hal, could see the toll it had taken on her. For Hal, the revelation was incomprehensible. He couldn't understand how something so terrible had happened under his roof, right under his nose. Worse still, the perpetrator was his own brother, the man he had trusted. Hal's anger and guilt consumed him. He was filled with a burning desire for revenge. But John was in jail, out of reach. There was nothing Hal could do to right the wrongs that had been committed, and the helplessness gnawed at him. To make matters even worse, Hal's mother, the girl's grandmother, chose to side with John. She refused to believe that her son could be capable of such an atrocity. Instead, she publicly claimed that Michelle had fabricated the story, accusing her granddaughter of lying. The small town of Wilshire, once a haven of support and familiarity, became a breeding ground for rumors and speculation. Whispers spread through the community, and soon some neighbors began to question the Rogers family's story. Their once supportive community had turned cold and distant. The isolation was unbearable. The family, already broken by the trauma, now found themselves abandoned by their neighbors and left to navigate their pain in silence. It was during this difficult time that Joe came up with a plan. The family needed a break, especially the girls. They needed to escape the weight of the farm, the town, and the painful memories that surrounded them. A vacation, Joe thought, might be the answer. The girls could have the chance to be kids again, free from the darkness that had settled over their lives. Hal agreed that it was a good idea. Though he decided to stay behind and tend to the farm, Joe and the girls would go without him. It would be a girls' trip, a chance for them to reconnect, laugh, and experience some much-needed freedom. When Joe shared the plan with Michelle and Christy, they were thrilled. They had never been on a real vacation before, and the idea of hitting the open road, leaving Ohio behind, and exploring new places filled them with excitement. Joe put them in charge of planning the trip, letting them choose the destination and plan the itinerary. The only restrictions were that they had to stick to a budget and travel by car. After careful consideration, the girls decided on Florida as their destination. It was the perfect place for a fun-filled getaway, with amusement parks, beaches, and plenty of sunshine. For weeks, they eagerly pored over maps and brochures, meticulously planning every detail of the trip. They wanted to make the most of their time and include as many sightseeing stops as possible, both on the drive down and during their time in Florida. On May 26, 1989, the day of their much-anticipated trip arrived. The girls packed their bags, loaded them into the family's light blue Oldsmobile, and said their goodbyes to Hal. With excitement in the air and the open road stretching out before them, they set off on the first real adventure of their lives. The drive took them south on I-75, a long highway that wound through Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Georgia. The car was filled with excitement, anticipation, and the chatter of three women who, for the first time in a long while, were looking forward to something good. They made their first overnight stop in Georgia, staying at a small roadside motel to rest before continuing the journey the next morning. It was a long drive, but their spirits remained high. When they finally crossed the Florida state line, the warm air, palm trees, and bright skies greeted them, promising adventure. For the next few days, the Rogers women embraced the joy of their vacation. They visited amusement parks, zoos, and tourist attractions, letting the lightheartedness of the trip wash away, if only temporarily, the sadness they had left behind in Ohio. Joe even sent a postcard back to Hal, playfully complaining that her daughters were running her ragged, dragging her all over the state. But the truth was clear. She was having a wonderful time with them. For a brief moment, it seemed like the darkness that had hovered over their lives had lifted. But that lightness was fleeting. Unbeknownst to them, their story was about to take a tragic turn, one that would leave them lost forever. On June 1st, after spending a few fun-filled days in Orlando, Joe and the girls left their hotel and made their way to Tampa. They planned to visit one last amusement park before beginning the long drive back to Ohio. Hal expected them to return home on June 3rd, but as that day came and went with no sign of his family, Hal's initial calm started to falter. At first, he didn't panic. Hal was a patient man, one who didn't overreact when things didn't go exactly as planned. He figured that maybe Joe and the girls had decided to extend their trip, to enjoy a few more days of sunshine and fun. But as the days passed, and no word came from them, Hal's worry deepened. By June 6th, Hal's concern had grown too great to ignore. He contacted the police and reported his family missing. The initial investigation was slow. Authorities speculated that perhaps the Rogers women had simply chosen to stay longer in Florida, seeking a break from the difficult circumstances back home. After all, the family had been through so much, and the idea of returning to the farm, where painful memories and the town's whispers still lingered, might have been too much for them. But as more time passed, and no communication came from Joe or her daughters, the police began to take the case more seriously. Then, on June 8th, a breakthrough came. A maid at the Days Inn Motel in Tampa entered room 251 to clean it. She had serviced the room days earlier, but when she entered it again, something seemed off. The beds were still made, the towels hadn't been touched, and the luggage remained exactly where it had been left. It was as though no one had been in the room since she had last cleaned it. Concerned, the maid reported the situation to her manager, who quickly contacted the police. When officers arrived at the scene, they discovered that the room had been registered to Joan Rogers and her two daughters, Michelle and Christy. They had checked in on June 1st, but no one had seen them since. A thorough search of the room revealed a camera, and two photos remained undeveloped on the roll. The first photo showed Michelle, crouched down, rummaging through her suitcase, likely getting ready for the evening ahead. The second photo was taken from the room's balcony, capturing a peaceful view of Tampa Bay as the sun began to set. These were the last known moments of the Rogers family. The discovery of the camera and the abandoned room set off alarm bells. Authorities widened their search, and soon, they located Joe's car, parked at a public boat ramp less than a mile from the motel. The car had been sitting there for days, undisturbed. Inside the car, police found 2 brochures. One had handwritten directions to the boat ramp, written in Joe's familiar handwriting. The second brochure also had directions, this time to the Days Inn motel, but the handwriting was unfamiliar. This immediately raised suspicions. Someone else had been in contact with the Rogers women. The police began to piece together the timeline of events. They focused on Joe's note, particularly the last few words, blue with white. Investigators believed this referred to something Joe was supposed to look for, perhaps a boat at the boat ramp. As the investigation continued, police made a chilling connection. Just days before Joe's car had been found, the Coast Guard had discovered 3 bodies floating in Tampa Bay, about 25 miles from where the car had been parked. The bodies had been severely decomposed, making identification difficult. However, with the discovery of Joe's abandoned car and the eerie note, it now seemed likely that the 3 unidentified bodies were those of Joe, Michelle, and Christy. The grim reality began to set in. The Rogers women had been murdered. Through a slow, painstaking investigation, police were able to reconstruct the tragic events of June 1st. After checking into their motel that day, Joe and her daughters had gone out for dinner. At some point during the afternoon, they had crossed paths with a man who offered to take them out on his boat to watch the sunset over Tampa Bay. He was a white man in his 30s, with blonde hair and a mustache, unremarkable in appearance, and seemingly harmless. Joe, likely feeling that the man was friendly and trustworthy, accepted his invitation. It's believed that this man provided directions to the boat ramp where his boat was docked, leading Joe to write down the note they later found. He had also likely told her to look for his blue and white boat. That evening, around 7:30 p.m., Joe and the girls were seen leaving the motel restaurant. They returned to their room briefly, possibly to change into more casual clothes for their boat ride. The camera captured what would be their final moments. A picture of Michelle preparing her things, and a serene photo of the sunset from their balcony. Later, they drove to the boat ramp, where they met the man and boarded his boat. Unbeknownst to them, this boat ride would be their last. What exactly happened on that boat remains unclear. However, based on the evidence, investigators believe that once the boat was far enough out into Tampa Bay, the man turned on the women. He likely assaulted all 3 of them, then bound their hands and feet and gagged them with duct tape. After rendering them helpless, he carried out his horrific plan. One by one, he took heavy cinder blocks, tied ropes around their necks, and secured the other end of the ropes to the blocks. He then pushed each woman overboard, forcing them to struggle as they sank beneath the water, weighed down by the cinder blocks. It would be days before their bodies were discovered. On June 4th, 3 days after they were killed, the bodies of Joe, Michelle, and Christy surfaced in Tampa Bay. The warm waters had accelerated the decomposition process, making identification difficult. Autopsies later revealed that all 3 women had been alive when they were thrown into the water, as water was found in their lungs. Initially, no one connected the unidentified bodies to the missing Rogers family. But once Joe's car was found and the police pieced together the timeline, they contacted Hal back in Ohio. They requested dental records for his wife and daughters, and with those records, Hal's worst fears were confirmed. His family was gone. The man responsible for their deaths was eventually identified as Oba Chandler, a suspected serial killer with a history of violence against women. Chandler had evaded capture for several years, but his arrogance ultimately led to his downfall. He had bragged to neighbors about his date with 3 women on the bay, unaware that police were closing in on him. In 1994, Chandler was convicted of the murders of Joan, Michelle, and Christy Rogers. He was sentenced to death, but never showed any remorse for his actions. For nearly 2 decades, he sat on death row, unvisited and isolated. His family wanted nothing to do with him. On November 17th, 2011, Oba Chandler was executed by lethal injection. He died without acknowledging the pain and suffering he had caused. For Hal Rogers, watching the execution brought a small measure of closure, though nothing could ever truly heal the wounds left by the loss of his wife and daughters. The story of the Rogers family is one of the darkest to emerge from small-town America. A harrowing tale of betrayal, loss, and the unimaginable cruelty that some are capable of. The memory of what happened that night in Tampa Bay will remain with all who hear it. But for now, as the storm outside begins to settle, this chapter drifts into the shadows. The rain softens, and with it, the weight of the story begins to ease, slipping away like the final drops of the storm. And now, we bring this tragic chapter to its close. Though the pain of this tale endures, tonight, it recedes into the quiet stillness that follows. Justice, though long delayed, was ultimately served, bringing some peace to a story that might have otherwise been an unbearable burden. The shadows that once clung to the Rogers family have lifted, and the memory of their loss, though still poignant, becomes part of the past. At Slumber Darkly, we explore the darkest corners of real-life stories, where the truth is often stranger and more haunting than fiction. This journey through the Rogers family's tragic end has now reached its conclusion. The quiet that follows offers space for reflection, and as the night moves on, this story, like the storm, fades into memory. Good night, and sleep well.